hi everybody, I'm Eva Pascoe. I'm the host for today and also the chair of Cyber Salon, which organized today's session. So the reason for the session is that UK tracking app is being launched. It had a little starting pilot in Isle of Wight, so we were following up with great interest. But the key important things for us is how it will play on the mainland. So starting from the Cyber Salon history, back in 1997 when we formed in response to third-party cookies because we thought that it's really started appearing that internet turned into one big surveillance machine. And we really spent the last couple of decades trying to track, improve, and protect digital rights. In 2015, we got quite close to launch Digital Bill of Rights. We even got it to House of Commons with many of you here on the chat that were supporting it. So Tom Watson, remember him? David Davis, John McDonnell, they all supported it. We had debates in House of Commons. And I think if it wasn't for Brexit, we would have got it through. So now we're thinking, maybe medical surveillance is a good opportunity to review how comfortable or uncomfortable we are with the framework for legal medical surveillance and digital rights surveillance. And what can we use considering that, this is gonna affect everybody. This app will be beeping in your pocket if somebody has been tested and somebody has been found that you need to be isolated. So we are facing it now pretty much, it's kind of more real. So I would like to explore that with all of you and, with the point of view of trying to be helpful because a lot of our friends are working in NHSX and probably will welcome feedback. So this is meant to be constructive rather than our usual snarking. So be positive. But just to kick it off, I would like to give each of you a minute to introduce yourself so you know what's coming. And then after we will do a few talks from everybody for a few minutes. And when we finish, we have discussion. We'll bring a few more people from the panel. Hi, Zoe. Hi, Zoe from Vegas. We can see you. And Stella from St. Albans. And then we will, at the end, switch to Twitch. So we have a game about control, actually called Control, that will be reviewed on twitch.tv/cybersalon, mainly because we are games outfit. We have a non-for-profit games studio called Digital Liberties. And we have done quite a lot of social activity and digital campaigning through games quite successfully. Last year, we launched a game with Google called On the Surface, questioning racial bias and bringing racial stereotypes and breaking them to young people. And that worked amazingly well. So I think games have a lot to offer for in trying to change behaviors. Right, okay, so if you can start introducing yourself, so maybe Justin first.
Yeah, lovely. So I'm Justin Fielder. For about 30 years, I've been building internet infrastructure, broadband networks. I was responsible for building the team and rolling out Sky Broadband after Sky bought EasyNet Global Services. And so my take of this is, at some point, I tend to be asked to build the infrastructure to look after or look at people. And so I tend to have a sort of what the implications are of using this infrastructure for good rather than for bad reasons.
Great. Phoebe?
Hi, I've been writing about technology in the workplace for some years and doing quite a lot of commissioned work for European Union and also the International Labour Organization of the UN on technologies that impact the workplace, so monitoring and tracking in particular, to look at worker efficiencies, productivity, sometimes location, and then sometimes even sentiment and sociometric sort of kinds of solutions, as it were. So my last book looked at the usage of these types of tracking devices professional workplaces, which was curious to me because they're linked to wellness initiatives, which is, of course, the first time I met Eva when she came to see me give a talk before even this book was published. So, which was pretty cool in London. So, and
you can show the book, Phoebe. We love the book. We should all get it.
It'd be rude not to. To be honest, it's just come out in paperback, so it's cheaper. It was originally absurdly expensive. I would send a PDF, but anyway, so there's the quantified self in precarity, work technology, what counts, taking a kind of critical perspective around what it means. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to Stefan.
Yes, so I'm a program leader. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you can hear me. Yeah.
Yes, hello. So I'm program leader for our BA Digital Media at Middlesex University. Our students from the first year onwards learn to conceptualize and build apps, but we're also looking at various concepts such as open source that I would like to discuss tonight. So an open source versus a rather hermetic approach to apps, and then also, of course, the dimension of internationalization. So tracking COVID cases globally and frameworks that will support such an approach.
Great. Okay, so can we move to Murray?
Hi folks, I'm coming to you from Cape Town in South Africa. I describe myself as an anti-surveillance activist, but Phoebe made me think twice about that. But I've been writing and campaigning around surveillance and privacy protections in South Africa for some years. As it happens, I actually also have a book about surveillance, but it's a children's book about a baby tracking robot, which I mainly use as a laptop stand. So I'm going to take it back and put it there. Which is what happens when you write your own book, is often you have more copies of them than you need for anything other than laptop stands. Yes.
Amazing. Okay, and then we've got Maciek.
Hi, I'm Maciek Ziarkowski, and I've been in London for a few years now, working on as a data engineer and spatial data scientist, mostly focusing on cities. And I have also worked on a project about footfall tracking, so measuring pedestrian traffic on high streets. So I'm mostly interested in how technology ties into cities and all the nitty-gritty technical details of technical solutions to problems we encounter.
Okay, so we can maybe get you and Priya to argue after. I will just bring Priya in if I can. Oh yes, Priya, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right.
I don't know if you can see me, but yeah.
Yes, you can see a video, but we can't see you live, but the picture is very good.
No worries. So yeah, I'm Priya Prakash. I'm a designer and founder for Design for Social Change. I design habits and behaviors, some which I'm proud of, some which I'm not so proud of. And a couple of years ago, I started Design for Social Change to find a way to make cities better and create new habits and behaviors where people feel that they can improve their everyday life in urban cities and actually create those behaviors that can enable that.
Great. Priya is also a very serious mobile tech guru and pioneer. So hopefully she will make us correct our mistaken impressions of things. And just to finish off with Simon, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Simon. I'm a long-time Server Salon collaborator, and it's artist in residence. I've worked on video games and installation and make digital art. And tonight I will be playing through and reviewing and thematically discussing control in the context of the topic of today's talks.
Great. Okay, I think that's everybody. We'll bring some more people after. I will try to give you heads up before I bring you from the attendees to panelists. So hope that you have your pants on, or at least pretend to. Right, okay, so Justin, can we move on to my slides? I will just do a very quick intro. Right, so the reason why we wanted to get together is because this app is landing, and the question is, is that vaporware, or is it going to be useful? And if so, in what way? And if not, can we make it more useful? I've been working on the edges of footfall tracking for retail for quite a long time, using various different methods. Maciek will talk more about it. But one thing we noticed that it's just very hard to really find out who is where, and even harder, who are they near. So if you move to the next slide. Ben, if you can move, thank you. So people who have probably done most work on the tracking app so far, the South Koreans who launched into tracking each other with great aplomb. They're just that kind of society, and managed to persuade quite few people to download the app, but not as many as they were hoping. So we were watching that with great interest. So basically the app is logging all your contacts via Bluetooth. And if you are not contagious, then nobody will want anything from you. But if somebody is actually tested and defined as contagious, then the app goes through all your contacts and sends text to everybody, basically stay at home and sit there for 7 days to 14 days, depends on how close you are to the person. And really disrupting for your life. So we were just questioning, how many people actually really will be downloading it, because if you're not unwell, that's a big decision to lock yourself in a room for 2 weeks. They had to push on with facial recognition and credit cards because people were not terribly keen to share their locations. And the recent round was that so many people were leaving their phones at home, trying not to be traced and tracked, that now Koreans are issuing wristbands for the naughty ones that don't want to carry the phone. But it only will take a few days before everybody works out how to avoid that as well. So in some way, an example, but in some way also shows human nature, not quite what the government hoped for. So next slide. My big challenges, about 6 challenges I could count before I even get to privacy, were basically starting from how many people have mobile phones. So you can see that, yes, the young people have 1 or 2, but it sort of starts breaking about 55 to 64, where smartphones are not necessarily, just over majority has them. And then over 65, if people have it, it tends to be a Nokia as is easier to use. So not so many people in the group of interest actually has got the right tools. And the next slide, please. And the downloadability is even lower. So the teens will download everything, millennials less so, Gen X just over more than half, but boomers less than 40%. And this is American data, which for US would be a lot lower. So having a mobile phone and downloading things, it's quite a long journey. But if you move to the next slide, that's where I'm sort of encroaching on Justin's territory, but the location, if you detect things by cell phones, they're not very precise. The precision is only about 3/4 of a square mile, so not amazing. If you go by Bluetooth, it's somewhere between 0.5 meter to 10 meters. Even if there is a wall in between. So this will create probably quite a lot of false positives. The last remaining challenges for me was the battery. Obviously not everybody is running around with chargers in their pockets. So will we run out by 6 o'clock just as life gets interesting? We go to the pub and meet lots of people. Obviously Bluetooth is not quite as battery hungry as we initially thought, and apparently this new app has handled that. So I'm hoping that Justin will say a little bit more about it. But it is a question, because ultimately we don't want to jeopardize our normal use with that app running in the background. And a couple of other issues I had. One was about cybersecurity. If I have a phone from work, I'm not entirely convinced that my employers would be enjoying having to worry about blue snarfing and various Wi-Fi and cybersecurity issues. So would I need a second phone? Maybe. That hasn't quite been bottom up. And the final very important one is trust. As we know from Singapore, only 13% of people downloaded the app. And that's not really enough. I think the numbers and the models that Maciek and other people are looking at indicates maybe about 60% of us should have it. So where we are going to get the 60% to make it really run? Because at the current situation, the trust in the government is quite low. It's the Vote Leave team in number 10. They're going through a couple of court cases about misuse of data. They also allocated NHS contracts to Palantir, which is backed by CIA. So altogether, a very unsavory combination. So I think we just try to explore that. What would it take for people to trust the data to end up in NHS, which these days means Palantir? And on that note, if you just move to the next slide. Yeah, we were looking also with Phoebe on apps for work, because one app which is launching is used for warehouses. So basically people who work in close proximity might need to wear wristbands as mandatory solution. This is being debated at the moment. I think a lot of workers have welcomed this because it's more precise than the phone. But obviously, where is the data, and is the data going to be used sooner or later for exploitation? I think that is the big question. So just to finish off, I think I possibly have one more slide. There's a lot of people who are trying to set up in warehouses and stores just IoT beacon networks to help to clean and disinfect areas with a lot of concentration of people. So that's kind of the parallel activity. At the moment, because it's at work, it's not anonymous, maybe it should be, but just so you're aware, if anybody wants to follow it up, it's Lokix and Microshare that are doing it. Okay, so that's my intro. If I can just launch a quick poll, just to make sure that I know who is around. So who is here, and if you can just say which language you speak, so we can make references to where everybody is. The panelists can vote as well. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So who have we got around? Okay, looks that few Polish, few German, few others, and many English. Okay, fine. So we can use mainly English for our references. And also, at this point, I want to hand over to Stefan. So I talked about UK, but UK is only one of the places that has launched the app. The next one is Austria, that has been up and running for a little while now. So Stefan has got a very beautiful background of Vienna. Let's find him. So over to you.
Yeah, so this is the Vienna skyline at the United Nations and Austrian International Center. So yes, I'm based in London, but I've been following the discussions and the political discussions, public discussions, and the process of implementation of the Austrian Red Cross app that was inspired by the Swiss Stop Corona app. And what I found interesting, I believe, were three things. So firstly, when the app was announced, it faced a public backlash because track and trace sounds to Austrian ears, due to our history, it sounds like a threat. So we are very sensitive when it comes to sharing personal data. This was the moment when Max Schrems got involved. Max Schrems is an Austrian data rights activist, and he was behind the right to be forgotten. And he's also being featured in the documentary Facebookistan, which already in, I believe, 2015 or 2016 talks about Facebook's shadow profiles. So he got involved as well, and I believe the actual version 1.0 was co-audited by Max and by other Austrian data rights organizations. The code is open source, and the model is a decentralized model. So it utilizes the protocol DP3T, which is a digital contact tracing protocol at the moment being implemented and research developed by 11 European member states, and it is anonymous. So the only or semi-anonymous. So the only data. The only data being entered is indeed just a telephone number. We in Austria, we need to be able to map, so we need to register even prepaid SIM cards. So the only connection the app indeed does is the one between your name and your mobile phone. I would like to just very briefly play a 1-minute introductory video that introduces the concept of the Austrian app that's, as I've pointed out, very similar to the Swiss model. And I'm going to share my screen, share my computer sound. We'll hope it'll work. Yes, and just to wrap it up, the third point that I wanted to make. So, number one, the Austrian app is open source. Secondly, it's been audited by digital rights activists, and thirdly, it is the only app that has currently. It is the only app that allows people to send notifications even without being tested. This is what I understand. So just to wrap it up, I think a very, very interesting point for further research is the Wikipedia article on COVID-19 apps, because it also, I will put a link to this article into the chat, but I think the really valuable information there is also an overview of all of the different types of technical frameworks that become important when we look at an international perspective, when we're looking at a cross-border data exchange. So far from my side, and over to you, or back to you, Eva.
Okay, great. So the branding, which made me attracted to the topic, branding with Red Cross, is very interesting. So I just wanted to launch a quick poll to see what you guys think about the branding of the app. So what kind of partner would make it more likely for you to download Track and Trace app? So Red Cross, Boots, or your trusted pharmacy chain, NHS GCHQ, or co-branded with Tinder. So it looks that we are somehow split between Red Cross versus GCHQ. Okay, not that many people want to trust Boots. Well, I'm not surprised because they keep losing our data.
Losing prescriptions.
Prescriptions. So, okay, so let me just stop sharing. So just to mention for the Q&A, we will be taking the questions. So if you can add to Q&A and upvote, then we will take them as we progress. So if you can move on to Justin, who can fight the centralized, well, not as fine, but present the current setup with the UK centralized version versus the Red Cross Austria decentralized version.
Thank you, Eva. So Ben, if you could put up my slides, if that's possible. I've only got 4 slides. So it's sort of like, is centralized bad? Or are there some sort of interesting twists around that? And as I say, I come from very much being for 20, 25 years, having to put in the infrastructure into telecoms and broadband networks to do surveillance rather than using an app to do surveillance by sort of a secondary mean. So if you can move to the next slide, I thought I'd just recap on this slide what actually is the difference between the two models. So the sort of front end of it, collecting the data, is almost identical across most of the systems that are out there. But the big difference is when you self-identify that you've got symptoms, that in a centralized model, what happens is all of the contacts that you've been in contact with go to a central database. That server and the infrastructure will have some programs behind that, maybe some human beings actually behind that as well. That's one of the things about a centralized process, that the alerting is not automatic, that you can have medical experts intervening in the way that the decisions are made about who you were in contact with, how long it was for, where you were physically, can be part of that decision matrix, and then the alerts are sent out to everyone there. With a decentralized, literally all you say is my token, I've self-identified, and then that is redistributed amongst the network, and then it's the phone that has to make the decision. And I think on that point, it's quite interesting because I have a lot of affinity to that, because a lot of surveillance that's done in networks, particularly alongside catching illegal activity, is very much not about actually what is going on down the actual broadband line. It's more about who people are talking to and where that data is going between. So when I've been working with NCSC and MI5 on these types of things, very much it's about what is the person doing, not just what is the raw information that they've been transmitting. So if we move to the next slide, I then sort of just give a summary about where we are. Now, in the UK, the National Cyber Security Centre is very much involved in this. And that, for me, having been involved in this for 20, 25 years, is good news. NCSC is the place of default for all of the intercept work that the networks that I've built have had to do. They are sort of oversight. They are some of the world leading experts in this area. And so they were very open when the alpha and beta trial were there. They published the rationale behind it very quickly after. They published the source code on GitHub. and they very much have been seeking a lot of feedback. So a lot of the decisions that are in the current app, particularly around the way the initial Bluetooth handshake happens, how long these credentials last for, clearly the longer the credential lasts for, the less anonymous it becomes. Some of the issues around what happens if people have only met one or two people, or what happens if people have met a lot of people. There are certain scenarios where you can easily reverse engineer completely anonymous data back actually to individuals. And so there was a lot of papers published by NCSC around that. They asked a lot of questions. They said they gave the rationale for their decisions that they'd made. They gave the rationale between the centralized and the decentralized model. And that has been ongoing via a very sort of open, for me, process. So there's a blog. They're using State of It under the UK contact tracing to collect all these issues. And there's a lot of blogs happening about how they're doing. Now, the other thing is it's still in trial. So I think a lot of the press about it was very much a lot of these questions they needed to ask, and they need to get some real people to use it rather than a whole load of app developers doing it basically on a military facility, which is where the alpha trial was done. And there is enormous backlog. I mean, this is an NHSX app. So it's not a government app, it's an app that's being developed by the same people that developed the NHS app itself, so the much wider one, and are the people that are looking about, you know, engaging with Apple about your medical history that will turn up in Apple Health and the Google equivalent and various other stuff. And there's a massive backlog of stuff that A, they think they now know the answer, and B, they really still are asking for that. And also, I think it's very interesting for me that it's a bit like a lot of Intercept, that some of the ways that, you know, the discussion around RIPA and the IP Act was a lot about where does the data sit, and, you know, should it be anonymized, and how do you store it, and how long do you store it? And very much for me, you know, there's no exclusivity that if an app uses a centralized model, that it can't use decentralized and vice versa. And my guess, I don't know this, is that the NHS app will probably deviate towards using both. So there's nothing really to also stop assuming these types of debates happen for individuals and groups of people to actually shape the sort of controls that are given to the end user. So today, unless you say I've got symptoms and you delete the app, everything disappears. And to your point, Eva, you know, there's a whole load of stuff that's been done to make sure that your battery doesn't disappear. And some of the testing has shown that it really is just sitting in the background. It uses some tricks to keep itself running because it's not using the Apple or the Google APIs. But that shouldn't, and certainly in some of the testing, and if you load the app yourself and you run it, then it tends to use sort of 1-2% over a day, according to the sort of Apple monitoring. So there's sort of a whole load of stuff around that. And I think some of that is very much towards attitude rather than actually the technology. And so if you go to my sort of last slide, if we can just move forward to that, Ben. So here I just ponder some questions to think about. Why would anyone use this to track your movements or who you've met? Being what I know about telecoms network and having worked with security services on an app that probably is only going to get 50-60% penetration, there are far easier ways to work out where you've been or who you've met or various other stuff. So, you know, if I, with inside knowledge, was being a bad actor, this, for me personally, would be one of the last places where I'd look for actually finding stuff. And also the second one is what information are you actually giving up? Yes, you're saying that I've got symptoms, but presumably if you say that, you then go and get a test. If you get a test, you're going to give your details, particularly if it's a postal test, you're going to give your home details. All of that is being stored in a database. That is, you know, potentially far worse. If you're looking at it from a state of what insurance companies could do or what employers can do, there's a lot of NHS data which happens post you saying that I've got symptoms, and particularly with the push, so that anyone with symptoms can obtain a test. there's a whole raft of data which would be, for a bad actor, a far more lucrative place to go. And also, I think for me, there's a lot about what price does society pay if NHS can't get this data. So one of the major upsides about centralised is very similar to centralised monitoring under RIPA or the IP Act in telecoms networks, that you can correlate. And that does save lives. There's a lot of work that's been done by the security services that has found terrorist activities not by the individuals, but by the collection. And therefore, if you take that parallel to something which, you know I'm a gay person myself, a lot of focus has been on unvaccinatable diseases, particularly HIV, as a virus that has no vaccine. And therefore, how do you eradicate that without a vaccine? And certainly a lot of the work that has been done around testing and then tracing those contacts that you've had sexual contact with, in the case of HIV, actually has made a dramatic difference to both the infection rates. And so there's a whole, particularly within Westminster Council with Dean Street, there's this whole target zero, which is to actually get HIV new infections down to zero without a vaccine. And so I think there's a massive sort of balancing act between what do you give up, but what do we as a country get in tackling a disease that actually fundamentally doesn't have there. And, you know, it's a bit of a glib point, but again, it goes back to, if I wanted to trace you, if you want to test, you need a phone number that is eminently traceable, similar to Austria. You have to give your, your ID credentials in order to get a phone number in the country. And if you want your results back, you're going to have to give something over which enables you to be tracked. So I think that's the bit. And then the two screenshots that I've got on the right are, you know, one which is Babylon Health, which I use. It now has an AI engine. I can chat to it. It will try and work out what is wrong with me. I'm giving up enormous amounts of information. And then the second one is, you know, the sort of health records within the Apple ecosystem. I know NHS isn't participating in that, but very much then, you know, your records as part of NHS is this really NHS data? And therefore, if we trust the NHS for all the other stuff, why wouldn't we trust the NHS in saying, oh, I've got a bit of a cough or I've lost my sense of taste? So those were the questions that I wanted to ponder, Eva.
Great, very, very interesting. I do know this Dean Street team from my work that we were based in Dean Street for a very long time. And I think we should just hand over COVID to them because they do know what they are doing.
They do know very much.
20 years experience. But I think it's very interesting what you mentioned about the concept of risk and reward and the benefits and what are your trade-offs. So I think that's what we should explore. But I have a little poll. I wanted to ask you a question about the benefits of the app. So can I just launch it? So would you be more likely to download COVID app if you got financial benefits? So discount on poll tax, discount on congestion charge, or parking, or money off beer in Wetherspoons? What's your preference? Right, so it's somewhere between beer and poll tax. Right, so we can tell the government that that's all they need to do to get us to download the app. Easy. Yeah, because I think they're assuming, you know, when I listen to Matt Hancock saying that, you know, it's a public duty, I think at this point, this governmental team is not really in position to persuade people to follow public duty. So maybe the Wetherspoon discount could be better. Okay, thank you very much, Justin. That's raised more questions than answers as always, but we'll come back to them. And can we move to Muz Hunter from South Africa? Really, really pleased to have you here. Very interesting that South Africa has taken very different route to the app and ended up in much better place. So maybe you can take us through the story now.
Sure. Well, the first thing I thought before we go there is that it would be interesting to know how many people took part in that poll versus like myself and several other people in the chat thought, well, none of these choices worked for me. Because it might mirror what you see is that there's 75% of those who would use the poll, who would use the app would like a poll tax, and 75%, 25 would like money off beer. But the biggest majority is people who vote not to download it at all. So let me just share my screen because I haven't organized myself in part of this slideshow screen thing. So actually mine is not about a better place, but as you said, it's complicated. So South Africa has adopted a slightly different approach, and that is around access not to people's location, or attempting to access people's location through access to telco data, not a contact tracing app. And we're going to talk, I'm sure that we're going to hear in a little bit from the next presentation why telco data is not actually that useful for that purpose. But there was some interesting stuff about the oversight that they tried to put in that I think is worth talking about. The context for my discussion is around the concerns, the public concerns around our state surveillance policies and practices, particularly under the previous president, Jacob Zuma, who left office in 2017 or 2018. And that has really, in a very real way, has shaped the contact tracing policy that we have. So that's a 2015 cartoon that was done in sort of to recognize the work of activists working on surveillance. And that's our presidential buildings there on the right. Now we have a number of issues which I won't go into, but particularly state interception has been used to target journalists. So the state security structures are very politicized, or have been very politicized. They were targeting investigative journalists who were investigating corruption and trying to identify their sort of sources. They also had been spying on people who were perceived as political rivals of the president and his faction. And also, as it turns out, spying on activists as well. So that was nice. A second issue that came up is that aside from where people in those positions of power have actively and maliciously used their spying powers for things that they knew were wrong, spying on an adversary or a rival, there was a big problem with the fact that our law has particularly weak protections for metadata. So not the content of people's communication, but the information around their communication. So the identity of who they contact in particular, but also things like their location. So lots of national laws fail to protect that stuff, but in South Africa it's an issue. So that has led to some anti-surveillance activism. And in particular, it's led to a constitutional court case to challenge our surveillance laws around the fact that they lacked oversight, they lacked privacy protections. One of the things that we were concerned around is that they lacked what is called user notification. So someone whose communication is intercepted would by law never come to know that their communication was intercepted. There's not a post-surveillance notification. There's also not in the UK, incidentally, but most progressive legal frameworks make sure that the person who's targeted for surveillance gets notified in the end. And the reason why that notification is quite important is that if you don't have that notification, you can spy on whoever you like for whatever purpose. And because they never find out about it, obviously they can't challenge it and you don't get into trouble. The reason that's important is because COVID-19 comes along. And there are really two kinds of responses that we see from the new-ish president, Cyril Ramaphosa. There's obviously a very strong, albeit flawed, public health response, an attempt to roll out protections for the public. There also has been quite a controversial security-related response. So the military has been deployed to help enforce our lockdown. There have been a lot of incidents of police brutality, and those may well have made the news where you are. What's interesting about South Africa is that the digital contact tracing that I'm about to talk to really belongs in the public health sector and belongs to those public health efforts. It isn't actually linked to the security responses in the way that you are seeing in some countries. So what is this digital location data? What does it all involve? So I'm going to come to what's wrong with it in a second. But the policy that was produced in very short order, literally within just a couple of weeks, provides that the Department of Health can go to your mobile network operators purely for the purpose of identifying the movements of someone who's either tested positive for COVID-19 or has been in touch with someone who's tested positive for COVID-19. So it can't be used for any other purpose. There was a specially appointed judge who oversees the decisions that are made in those requests. Doesn't have the power to authorize them, but does have oversight. The third point is that the policy has an expiry date, and I think that's very important because there's so much concern the world over that you're having these emergency powers that might outlast the emergency. And then the last point, and that really is quite important, is that it provided that subjects, people whose location is intercepted or seized, would be notified of the fact within 6 weeks of the whole, basically at the point at which the policy expires, everyone would get notified. There's lots of problems with this policy, but it was kind of amazing to see that in emergency regulations, the state actually produced the kinds of oversight that we'd been asking for that they said they couldn't possibly have provided. And that is, it's really heartening. And the final point is that all of the data that was intercepted would also have that same expiry point. So so I found myself in the unusual situation of looking at what was happening across the world and looking at the past conduct of my own state and saying, actually, I don't usually celebrate these things, but that's really not too bad in comparison. A few problems. We're going to talk a little bit about why geolocation, spatial, the mobile network location data actually isn't useful for that. And Eva already touched on that, is that it's just not that accurate. The second problem is that implementation has been a massive problem. So we're trying to find out how it's been used, but we're pretty sure that these systems aren't up and running. Shame, that screenshot is from a very unfortunate moment when the president tried to put on a mask on TV. He's been very presidential, he's been wonderful, but unfortunately for about 5 seconds on live TV, it was just over his eyes like that. It was very sad. So some people have looked at all of this and said, actually what we want is a decentralized app, kind of like the Red Cross app, but it really isn't realistic to the context of South Africa. So one of the things that separates South Africa from the global north is that most of the population is poor, has relatively low quality phones, has problems with access to data, and also lives in a high crime environment. So many working class South Africans are likely to have their phones stolen or break or have to be replaced every couple of months. And in that context, it really adds to the complications that we've already talked about when it comes to uptake and getting enough adoption. But the story then is not, as Eva says, it isn't necessarily taking us to a better place, but it was really worth noting that emergency regulations from a privacy protection point of view don't necessarily need to be awful. It is actually possible for states, when they're acting seriously and when they're taking privacy concerns seriously, to develop good policy, sometimes policy that is better than the old stuff that wasn't developed in emergency. But in this case, efficacy is really the issue. And if we are giving up any kind of right to privacy, we need to have a very clear picture that when we're giving up that right, we're getting something in return. We're getting a public health benefit. And in this case, it isn't there. And that was speed dating with Murray on digital tracking in South Africa.
Great, amazing. Thank you very much. And this is a perspective where we normally don't see so many positives coming through the process. So I think that's one of the things we wanted to concentrate on. I'm just bringing someone for a quick comment, because I know Rich has got a live stream to go to, but I just wanted to launch a poll following up from what we just discussed on the government actions. So if you could take a look at the poll. So which actions would encourage you to download, track and trace app and share contacts of the government? So clear, defined sunset clause, independent judge to oversee data management, ethical committee to oversee it, promise from Matt Hancock that he will not keep your data, or none of the above. So I give you a minute more. The results. So ethical committee of privacy activists to oversee. Right, well, then we should argue for that, because obviously if it's taken from representative parts of the society, we can probably figure out the consensus. I think that just sums up that the government went about it in a bit, cack-handed way, because that deliberation could have been done before they launched it, as opposed to having to recover it now. Okay, so I will stop sharing. Right, so I invited Rich because he's been working for quite a few years on a game about surveillance, and through that has learned quite a lot of interesting questions. So do you want to say a few minutes about what's your take on the situation?
Wow, yeah. Well, so I guess the game that I'm making is called Off Grid, and it's meant to be an introduction to how everyone leaves data around that they can be controlled by. So essentially, instead of collecting weapons and attacking the guards in the buildings that you go through, you have to essentially map the networks and collect their personal data and use it to manipulate their behavior. To be honest, this has been insightful for me more than opinion bearing. So I feel a little bit like all of the other experts in the room have had far more interesting things to say than I can. I come from a background, I suppose, that you could call hacker culture or kind of maker culture. And I think generally speaking, the kind of open source communities that swing around those roundabouts tend to be more sort of skeptical of this kind of thing than your average user. I do think that uptake is going to be the biggest problem, and I think even if you did give people council tax discounts, that's going to be still a difficult hurdle to overcome. The idea of an ethical panel or a judge with oversight, I think, as we've seen with the FISA courts and various other things in the States, it doesn't really seem to be concrete enough for people to necessarily trust in. I actually voted on the sunset clause because I thought if you at least said the data that is all collected will be shut down, 12 months after we've decided we don't need to track and trace people anymore, and deleted, as best we can as to how data actually ends up being deleted, then perhaps that might be an option. But it just seems so uncertain to me, I suppose.
Okay, so I think we're looking forward to playing your game when it starts coming through, and yep. I think you're hosting few live streams, so we might rejoin you after we finish ours. Because
yeah, please do. We're hosting on Twitch later. If you go to twitch.tv/Ziarkowski, and we're actually supporting a hacker community or a set of hacker communities who are rebuilding their villages from a hacker camp called Chaos Communication Camp, which is kind of a bit weird and niche, but quite interesting. So yeah, if you fancy joining us then, and then.
Okay, thanks Rich, thanks. And for those who joined later, remember that after the session, we will move to twitch.tv/cybersalon for live review of game called Control. Right, so back to our lineup. So if I can move things to Phoebe, who is involved in surveillance at work and has done many years of work on the topic. So what's your take on the app and also the apps that are being launched at work for surveillance at work?
Thank you, Eva, and thanks to the speakers. It's been really interesting so far. I'm pondering what to speak about. I don't have much to say, but I think what I want to do is, in a way, I'm going to take a bit of a side, maybe a parallel in a way, approach to my discourse. And the reason is that there are a lot of things that perplex me and make me a little bit curious around some of the social, political kind of realities that this recent pandemic, for me anyway, have highlighted, have really brought to the surface. I think things that were probably there, but things that we need to take quite seriously. So my research, having looked at technology and the workplace for so long, and in particular the way that across different kinds of workplaces, from the streets to the homes to the office to the warehouse, so the different kinds of tracking that have already existed, which maybe you could argue started in the 1800s in factories, and then of course moving forward to penetrate lots and lots of different kinds of workplaces, to the point where we've normalized those kinds of things. I mean, we're using calendars, the electronic calendars, like that are of course algorithmically derived, where, you know, if you're, let's say, working as a taxi driver for one of the major platforms now, your you know, your every single moment is tracked by specific technologies. And so I think what it's showing to me is that we've really normalized so much of data collection and the personal, to the point where we can have these debates and forget, as far as I'm concerned, the most important question with this kind of with the tracking devices that have supposedly worked in South Korea. I mean, we talk about it as though, oh, isn't this, you know, brilliant? You've got a country that's experienced pandemics, understands responses, as it were, and also has a totalitarian history, absolute factual information on that one. And so then you've got to really pick apart the questions to do with what does it mean for a population, to whether or not there's a trust element to data collection and usage. And I thought it was fascinating what you said just now around the consideration that there could be an elimination of data that's collected, so we could have a time-bound dimension to how apps could work. But then again, whether or not there's no way that you as a citizen can actually necessarily find that. I mean, you can do a freedom of information request, but the kind of work that it takes in order for this to become realized in a way that one can kind of actually justify or believe, for me, is the most important kind of question that we need to be asking. Because in the end, if this app doesn't work in the context of Britain, and frankly it won't, you've got to have 50% or higher people signing up to it. We've just discovered that you've got very low percentages of motivation and incentivization. I think Eva's done this has been a really cool way of kind of as a little bit of a bite-size sort of testing, just to find out the kind of views, is that in the end you have very different political configurations within which these types of practices are being rolled out. And of course, Britain being one of the most highly surveilled already countries in the world, London, how many CCTVs on every single block, second to pretty much Beijing, right? I mean, well known. We've got the Snoopers Charter, which was of course Theresa May's baby. The minute she became, we were discussing, I remember having these chats with you guys, including when we were the kind of House of Commons some years ago, and then before even she was on the scene, but not in the role she then took. But then so what I'm saying is that you've got this real normalization to this, and people forget the most important question is, will it work? And can we not do these things with more kind of, let's say, analog methods? You have in New York City attempts where they're using telephones, they're using, you know, old school sit down and talk to people, okay, socially distanced wise, but the firefighters there have been experimenting with very different methods. You don't necessarily have to wear something on your body that tracks every single location you are where you are during the day, just in case you are coming across someone. Because the next question for me, so that's the first question. Second question is, the mythology around what it even can mean for social isolation to exist. Quarantine does not and cannot exist in this country, right? Unless you have some area where you can actually authentically remain without contact with other people. It completely obliterates all sensible questions around how you can have access to your basic needs, how, you know, if you, and all these social norms that surround that. So let's say your home environment is also uncomfortable. Let's say there's a domestic abuse situation. In Britain, so at the moment, they've just now implemented quarantine, which of course everyone's querying. So why did it take you so long to do it? People could argue, oh, because you're not able to roll out a kind of a surveillance mechanism like so many other brilliant and successful previously authoritarian or currently authoritarian countries. This is what I mean. We need to focus on the kinds of what the ontology, what the epistemology is behind the kinds of questions and the debate that's happening right now. So do we want to normalize this kind of practice in Britain? Because I don't think that the data is going to be erased. I don't know why there's a necessity for so much personal data to be collected on something that frankly should be a health issue. But I think there are other ways to do it. And for some reason, we're not talking about those things. So that's the second point. And then the third question for me, and then I'll stop, because of my specialism on, of course, the work environment and forms of technologies. So what fascinated me is how quickly people were asked to work from home. So I think the already existing delineations of skilled work, semi-skilled work, unskilled work kind of shifted like almost overnight. That there are people who are just expected to A, have a comfortable home environment, B, have maybe an office in their home, and C, to basically not just work at home, but to go online. So people are saying, oh, it's homework. It's not actually go home to work, because people who are already able to work online are fine, because you had the mobility dimension already there. We know about it. You could work in a cafe, you could work anytime, anywhere, all of life kind of work, right? So I think for me, it just exacerbated other questions that we have to do with the massive problems in housing, for example, in London. So people who are not able to suddenly work from home, you know, whatever their kind of jobs are, you are in situations where you're immediately biologically unprotected if you are a key worker. So I think for me, that was interesting to look at. So how the person automatically being invited to work at home was already quite privileged. I say privileged, but at least somehow had a secure position. Then you had at the semi-skilled level, you maybe had a chance to work at home, maybe you didn't, and you often, I think, had to fight for it. So again, you are immediately physically exposed potentially to a virus instead of being able to socially isolate in your quite cush environment. And then, of course, key workers being the worst paid, the least socially protected, and the most undervalued of all of these categories. And for me, I think the only potential positives that kind of could come out of this is that there is a recognition that you've really, I mean, okay, so we're in Britain, this is a class-driven society, but that you've got such a core backbone for how the supply chain operates, that again, sort of immediately is put into these conditions of risk, and then those who are already in relatively comfortable environments. So what I'm hoping comes out of this, oh yeah, and I didn't mention the final thing, which is of course the new kinds of software. I mean, the software market, the industry around tracking, I say tracking, but productivity measuring types of technologies is booming right now, because of course, let's say, okay, so I'm the knowledge worker working from home, and I used to have, let's say, so relatively, I guess, a relatively flexible work schedule. The minute your boss doesn't have the capacity to see whether you're in your office or not, of course, and it's all, you know, becomes part of the infrastructure for your daily work. For example, let's say I'm a software designer. So immediately, a lot of the potential quality of work or the kind of gray areas that I used to enjoy are gone. And I partly know this because I'm doing a project that looks at data service workers who were in work where, because of security quality reasons, were required to work in a kind of third-party contractor environment. Now being asked to work from home, their already existing highly surveilled and frankly quite stressful and intensified environment becomes even more so. So it's like I say, there's this real question mark for me around what home working actually is. For me, it's actually just online working, and then the kinds of, I guess, securitization dimension to that, or the exacerbation in already existing tracking. Anyway, as I say, it occurred to me, I just wanted to ask some of those questions and then put it out for, I guess, potential for discussion. Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you very
a lot
much,
for inviting me, Eva.
Thank you very much. That was very good perspective. I see a lot of these mandatory apps being launched, like, you know, basically it's the next golden pot for everybody who has got a bit of beacon somewhere in the cupboard. So let me just quickly launch an app about apps at work. So if you had to use app tracing app at work, and if it was mandatory, would you use it if it was only proximity and anonymous? You would use it if it keeps your team safe, only if there was a worker oversight of data use, or you just wouldn't use anything, full stop. So let's give it a minute. Yeah, I've seen it from warehouses, retail. I think police has got one. So basically, you know, everybody's trying because it sounds, you know, we all techies, we all guilty of there is an app for it. And sooner or later there will be, but you know, it's not, maybe not quite yet now. Okay, I'm just going to end the poll and share the results. So what do we think? Right, so only if there was a worker oversight of data use. Right, so that follows with our previous answer that we feel more comfortable with the app if there was a representative ethical committee. So basically sounds like more participatory solutions people will accept rather than top-down government thinks that's the way it goes. Thank you very much. Okay, I've got a couple more people to bring. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming, Priya. And yeah, so this kind of lands very much in your bag. You are a practitioner and apps developer, geolocation apps developer. What do you think? Can this work? Can we make it better? What are the issues?
Yeah, so I was reflecting a lot. First of all, thank you, Eva and Maciek, for inviting me for this panel. It's great to see familiar faces like Lucy and Phoebe. I've been I've been a fan of your work, so it's nice to see everyone on this table. I was just gonna like reflect a bit as a designer of some of these things, because you know, we are talking about apps, we're talking about people downloading the apps, we're talking about the idea that people are going to do things, and we discussed a bit about this, Eva, before a call. So I just wanted to share, as putting my designer hat on just from an information architecture perspective, just before we even get into the problem of privacy and other things. And I don't know if you can see my screen.
Yep.
So I feel like, in general, because I work a lot in the urban infrastructure space like Maciek, and I believe that the problem, and before this, I've been designing a lot of peer-to-peer systems, like, you know, been designing the stuff like iPlayer and a lot of stuff on Nokia phones and lots of operating systems. I think I want to fundamentally like step back and look at what is the central question that we are figuring out this evening. And I feel like one of the questions, going back to what others like Stefan and Murray, and also, you know, we've been discussing is this central versus decentralized. And I think that's an interesting question, because if you take it from a data model perspective, you can obviously think about it as problem like, okay, you know, if something is centralized, you have a lot more control. But also in terms of the way the data collection happens. And we spoke a bit from Phoebe's perspective of whether people feel like they want to give their data and how much they trust the system. And Lucy's been raising those points as well. And I feel like what I've been looking at for my work in the city space is like, yes, there is this whole aspect of, you know, CCTV, you have Palantir, Eva, like you raised before, you have a lot of other systems which take the top-down centralized, you know, where citizens don't have the right of control. They don't know where the data is going. And then obviously you have the operating systems like Android and iPhone, where every time you have an app, you decide as a user permissions to say, yes, I can share my location, I can share my data. So you're giving permission to the app to allow yourself to give your location and data to kind of make it more relevant for you. And it's always been beneficial. So this slide I'm sharing for you, just to give you a bit of context, is from my urban planning perspective, is traditionally also when cities are trying to do this kind of stuff, it's interesting that we have this huge pandemic, but also cities, when they try to transform themselves, they follow a kind of a very simple process as well of trying to like collecting data, doing the planning stuff. And I was just kind of juxtaposing that the pandemic is actually, unfortunately or fortunately, it's a great use case for us to look at how we can rethink on how cities organize themselves and how systems organize themselves. Because unfortunately what happens is once you kind of get all this top-down data coming in through like traditionally from the government, and people who actually want to participate and give their information to improve the data, we don't have those interfaces. So we have Babylon Health, like was mentioned earlier before, but also what happens is traditionally, if you think about data models, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get a bit geeky right now, but I think I'm in a good audience.
Okay,
I
feel
think
free.
I have people
We
enough.
can take it.
Yes, exactly. So I feel like I can show my bum and get more geekier here. So I feel like what's interesting is like traditionally, when you think about data models, is we would have the citizen to citizen communication, or I would talk to Maciek, we stay in the same place, and we would have a conversation and it's word of mouth. But what's interesting is once that gets like appropriated by like, say, a database where, the same conversation gets online, and even more when you have sensors like IoT devices or information of things devices, CCTVs, other things, grabbing your location and other kind of externalities and creating a kind of a profile for yourself. And I know Phoebe discussed this, but what I find fascinating is like these profiles that we have through our MAC addresses and other things which are created in the cloud, which can be anonymized. And I know that Google and other people have been talking a lot about federated identity systems. And it's really interesting that Boris Johnson is talking about going with the Google Apple model. And I'm not surprised, because even if you think and having designed 2 or 3 Nokia operating systems, which uses very low battery power, I'm not surprised that you'll have to go for native companies where they can really manage the battery power very well. Because when they decide to take control of the user's system, they will find a better way of appropriating, instead of having an app which is using memory and using the energy, which is running not necessarily on the native system. So if you think about your iPhone apps or your Android apps which are native versus a third-party developer app like an NHSX app, it will use power very differently. So what I'm trying to say is like, I know I'm trying to mix different things together, but Apple and Google have more power than NHSX. And when they're creating the profile systems, they already have an existing profile for your Google account and your Apple ID account. And NHSX doesn't have that kind of trust relationship. And going back to Murray's point as well, the government doesn't have that trust relationship. And we have better consumer relationships than government relationships. Government relationships are actually quite painful. It's when somebody dies, somebody's in the hospital, somebody's done something dodgy, or you're in the police. So we don't really have a very nice relationship like we have with Amazon or other people. So can you imagine when you should do another poll, who do we actually trust to give our data to? I'm sure it's going to be Amazon, Apple, Google, then NHSX. And this is unfortunately because the way the user experience, which unfortunately is actually the one that decides how people trust people. So even though we would like to ethically feel like we should be with NHS, the user experience sucks so badly that we would prefer to be with Amazon and Google and Apple and other people who've made us consumers. So what I was trying to say is like, we will have this top-down big data coming from government, and we will give our little data and try to make the system better, because we want to not, earlier I was working in smarter cities and stuff like that, but we want to make a healthier city and citizens. But unfortunately what happens is you need to figure out, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is how you get people participating in the system. You can't just create an app and NHS, and you are so good, Eva, with the marketing aspect, because people aren't going to download an app. We know that. How many apps do people have on their phones? As a designer, I know very few people will go and download an app. you have to really convince somebody to download the app. So if you look at how people actually go into their needs, you really have to like focus on the very basic, from a citizen perspective, very simple things to get them to go up this food chain. And I don't want to spend more time on this because I know these slides will be available later, but we already have examples from Fitbit and from things like Strava. So those behaviors are embedded where people are ready to share their data, but they're doing that in like private organizations or networks. So the question I'd like to put back to the panelists and to the audience is, it's not a problem of trust, it's a problem of desire and benefit. So if we had a better user experience where people felt like they were happy to share their data for benefit, and they could see how their data is going to be used in a way to improve going forward the health system, you know, it's more about transparency, then we have a very different user experience. And right now things are like a black box. Every time I see Boris Johnson or Matt Hancock speaking there, I have no clue about Sage and other guys, what they're thinking. So how can we create better transparency and easier ways for people to understand how the decision-making works and how the data is being used to improve the system? And I think that right now as a designer, I'm finding it very hard to actually understand. So I'm confused. I don't have any answers, nor do I feel it's centralized versus like bottom up. I just feel like there is another way, which is the third way, where both systems have to come down, have to come together to make a change. It's not either or. So that's where I'll end it with.
Great, thank you very much, Priya. It's amazing to see UX perspective emerging, because clearly people who are writing it haven't really spent much time on it. So maybe we can recap a bit. But it's interesting to look at the local aspects. Let me just launch a poll. So would you download the local track and trace app? So yes, if my data was only available to my local NHS or to your GP, I guess. No, I don't trust local NHS with my data. No, I don't want feed Palantir data vaults. No, the tracking apps are not effective. So what is it to be on that one? What do you think? Yeah, I'm very interested in the local aspect. And I think few people mentioned in chat the trust in your GP. Although obviously we know from technical point of view that GP is not the one who holds your data in the drawer on a server under the desk as it used to be. But there is an inherent trust we can build on. So we're going to end the poll, share results. Right, so yes, if my data was only available to my local NHS. If technically that was possible, I think that would clearly be the winner. But unfortunately, NHS at the moment is not even exploring that. So I think the follow-up from our seminar would be to make that suggestion stronger and review if we can go back there. So just to round it up, can I just bring maybe Maciek, Priya, and Ben on Zoe Camper question? What about progressive web apps? Why does it have to be, what do we have to download anything? What does it have, why does it have to be an app? Which I think is an interesting question. Could we look at progressive web apps?
I think that could be a problem with using some of the hardware from the phones, like Bluetooth, to actually detect the contacts, because with progressive web apps you have slightly less, slightly fewer capabilities. So it's slightly more limited. I would expect definitely if it comes when it comes to, for example, something like the Google, Apple exposure API that they have just recently released, that would not really be available in a progressive web app. So there are some challenges there.
Right. Okay. So that's
true. The sensitive resolution on sensors like the Bluetooth sensor is not visible to the web stack. The web page can't really see that in the way that an app can. And if you were to try and do it without that, You know, yes, there's lots of web servers, and yes, they appear to be on every street corner, but they aren't on every street corner, and so we wouldn't have the location resolution on it. Yeah, it's a technical limits there.
Yeah, I agree on what Maciek said. It's just a fundamental problem on the software architecture where web-based apps are different from native apps. Native apps have more control on the mobile device, better kind of management. And even if it's third-party native apps versus like third-party apps versus native apps, they have better battery way of energy management. So if you have to make this truly democratic, then we have to figure out the whole internet versus browser versus app ecosystem. I personally believe that very few people are going to download an app unless they've been forced to. So I think the sole conundrum of here's an app from NHS is completely dodgy.
Okay, so that's probably answers Zoe's question. I can see a couple of good questions from, well, they're all good questions in QA, but we probably have time for a couple. So I guess the interesting question is, from David Wood, if the NHS has lost public trust because of the past mistakes with data security, and if GCHQ is mistrusted, is there a room for another organization? What do you think? Maybe Lucy can answer that. Sorry.
Well, you could hear her a moment ago, Lucy. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
I don't know why. Can't hear you. So I don't think the NHS, in terms of the practice staff, are untrusted. The doctors aren't. They're trusted. You know, the workers are trusted. In terms of collecting data, I think most patients have agreed to give their data to the NHS as far as the surgery is concerned. I mean, I think people, I don't know if Priya would agree, but I think people trust their doctors and they trust their GPs. I think what they don't trust are the sort of dark forces behind the NHS app, or the forces that are companies too closely associated with the government. It's the government that's not trusted. The links with American companies, Russian companies, Conservative Party members who are giving them money to open horse racing, all of that is not trusted. So I can't see how an app associated with these organizations will be trusted. That's why I think the Apple and Google app, if any, might be trusted more by people who don't know too much about Apple and Google. But there are people who've been talking about the human form of contact tracing, which has been practiced for decades, if not centuries. And this argument is not getting much airtime, but there is a professor in Newcastle who's on the Independent Sage Committee, and she's called Alison Pollock. She's been saying for about 3 months that, you know, we have been doing human contact tracing for decades, if not centuries. And all we really need is to train up the 750 NHS responder volunteers, of which I'm one, who've never been called on to do anything, who can sit on their phones and be trained, she thinks, within 2 or 3 days, maximum a week, to be able to ask the right kinds of questions to people. So I think it's an argument that hasn't had much airtime, but because she's on the Independent Sage, and Independent Sage is now getting more airtime, so Sir David King's on TV a lot, and the press are finally going to their press conferences, and it's all in the open, all their research is on YouTube, everything is published, there's nothing secret, we know who they are. I think they are a force which has possibly led the government to reconsider the top-down approach, to look more at the decentralized approach. But it is a bit crazy that the debate is happening after a lot of work's been done on the various apps, and there's still no contact tracing system that anyone trusts. in the UK as lockdown lifts.